take a deep breath and step back in time. Tonight we travel to the cold lands of the Vikings, where life was quiet, simple, and often very hard. Inside wooden longhouses, far from battles and raids, women worked from sunrise to night, cooking, weaving, caring for children, and preparing food for winter. So get comfortable, relax, and let's explore the peaceful side of Viking life. Together, this story is created by FMTJ, where history comes to life.
The Viking woman woke before dawn, not because she wanted to, but because the animals needed feeding and the fire had died overnight. Her life was a cycle of labor that modern people can barely comprehend, yet she managed it all with a level of skill that would put most of us to shame. This is the story of how she did it, one tedious task at a time. We think of Vikings as warriors and explorers, sailing off to distant lands while their women waited patiently at home. That's only half the story. The other half involves an endless rotation of back-breaking work that kept entire households running. These women weren't just homemakers in the way we understand the term. They were managers of complex operations that included textile production, food preservation, animal husbandry, and maintaining structures that could mean the difference between life and death in a Scandinavian winter. Let's start with the fire, because everything began and ended with the fire. In a Viking longhouse, the central hearth was the heart of domestic life. It provided warmth, light, and the means to cook food. Letting it go out wasn't just inconvenient, it was potentially catastrophic. Without matches or lighters, rekindling a fire meant using a fire steel and striking it against flint to create sparks that would catch on carefully prepared tinder. This sounds simple until you're doing it with cold fingers in a dark room before sunrise. The woman of the house would keep the fire going by banking it at night, covering the coals with ash to preserve the embers until morning. She'd wake up and carefully blow on those embers, adding dry kindling in precisely the right amounts. Too much, and she'd smother it. Too little, and it would die. This wasn't a skill you learned from a book. It came from years of practice and careful observation, usually taught by mothers to daughters starting in early childhood. Once the fire was going, the real work began. Water needed hauling. Most Viking settlements weren't built directly beside wells or streams for defensive reasons, which meant water had to be carried in heavy wooden buckets or leather containers. Imagine doing this in winter when the water source was frozen over and had to be broken through first. A household might need dozens of trips per day, depending on the number of people and animals. The animals. We need to talk about the animals because they were central to survival and utterly demanding. A typical Viking farm kept cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and chickens. Each species had its own requirements and temperament. Cows needed milking twice daily, a task that couldn't be skipped regardless of weather, illness, or any other circumstance. Sheep required constant monitoring, especially during lambing season, when a woman might spend entire nights in the barn, helping with difficult births. Goats were notoriously stubborn and prone to escaping their enclosures. Pigs needed slop prepared from kitchen scraps and foraged materials. Chickens had to be protected from predators and checked for eggs multiple times daily. All of these animals needed their living spaces cleaned regularly. Mucking out a barn in the middle of a Scandinavian winter ranks among the least pleasant tasks imaginable, yet it had to be done to prevent disease. But here's what most people don't realize about Viking animal husbandry. These women weren't just caretakers, they were veterinarians without formal training. When an animal fell ill, there was no one to call. The woman of the house had to diagnose the problem using knowledge passed down through generations, then treat it with whatever remedies were available. Herbs, poultices, careful observation of symptoms. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Either way, she had to try because losing even one animal could push a household toward starvation. Food preservation consumed enormous amounts of time and effort. There were no refrigerators, no grocery stores, no backup plans. Everything had to be grown, hunted, gathered, or raised, then preserved in ways that would keep it edible for months. Smoking meat was a constant activity during late autumn when animals were slaughtered before winter. The meat had to be cut into strips, hung in a smokehouse, and monitored to ensure it dried properly without rotting. Salting was another preservation method, but salt was expensive and had to be used carefully. Fish, especially, were preserved through a combination of salting and drying. The woman would clean the fish, split them open, coat them with precious salt, then hang them on outdoor racks where wind and sun would complete the drying process. This required constant vigilance because rain could ruin an entire batch. Dairy products needed daily attention. Milk couldn't be kept fresh for long, so it had to be transformed into butter, cheese, or skyr, a cultured dairy product similar to yogurt. Making butter meant hours of churning, an arm-numbing activity that couldn't be rushed. Cheese production was even more complex, requiring precise timing and temperature control to ensure proper aging. Women developed an almost supernatural sense for these things, knowing by touch and smell exactly when each stage was complete. Bread baking happened regularly, but it wasn't the simple process we know today. First, grain had to be ground into flour using hand-operated querns, two circular stones that required significant strength to operate. Grinding enough flour for a week's worth of bread could take several hours. Then came the mixing, kneading, and baking in ovens that had to be carefully monitored to maintain the right temperature. The textile work alone could fill every spare moment. Clothing didn't come from stores. Every thread had to be created from scratch. Sheep were sheared in spring, a messy job that required skill to avoid injuring the animals. The raw wool then needed cleaning, an unpleasant process involving multiple washings to remove lanolin and dirt. Picture standing over a large tub of water, repeatedly lifting and squeezing heavy, sodden wool. After cleaning came carding, using special brushes to align the wool fibres. Only then could spinning begin. Viking women used drop spindles, simple tools that required constant attention and practice to create even thread. A skilled woman could spin while walking, while watching children, while supervising other tasks. The thread then went on to looms for weaving, which was such a fundamental part of Viking life that loom weights are among the most common archaeological finds from this period. Weaving produced the fabric for everything: clothing, blankets, wall hangings that provided insulation, sails for ships. A single garment could represent hundreds of hours of work. This is why clothing was precious, mentioned specifically in wills and inventories. When something wore out, it wasn't discarded. It was carefully mended, then eventually cut down for children's clothes, then used as rags, then finally used as tinder for the fire. Nothing was wasted because waste meant more work to replace it. Children added another layer of complexity to everything. Viking women typically had multiple children, and those children needed constant supervision when young. But supervision didn't mean sitting and watching. It meant incorporating them into the work as soon as they were old enough to help. A 3-year-old could scatter grain for chickens. A 5-year-old could help with carding wool. By 7 or 8, children were expected to handle significant responsibilities. This wasn't cruelty. It was necessity and education combined. Children learned by doing, mastering the skills they'd need as adults. But it also meant the woman was simultaneously working and teaching, doubling her mental load. She had to complete tasks while explaining them, correct mistakes patiently while keeping productivity high, and ensure safety in an environment filled with fires, sharp tools, and large animals. Cleaning the longhouse presented its own challenges. Floors were typically packed earth covered with rushes or straw that absorbed spills and waste. These coverings needed regular changing, which meant removing all the old material, disposing of it, and laying fresh rushes. The walls were wood and needed maintenance to prevent rot. Smoke from the fire blackened everything, requiring periodic scrubbing with harsh lye soap made from wood ash and animal fat. Speaking of soap, that was another thing she made herself. The process involved saving wood ash from the fire, mixing it with water to create lye, then combining that with rendered animal fat. The mixture had to be heated and stirred for hours until it reached the right consistency. Too much lye and the soap would burn skin. Too little and it wouldn't clean properly. Again, this was knowledge gained through experience and careful observation. But we're only scratching the surface of what daily life demanded. The garden needed tending during growing season. Herbs for medicine and cooking required harvesting at specific times and drying carefully. Berries needed gathering when ripe, often meaning long walks into forests. Mushrooms could supplement the diet, but required expert knowledge to avoid poisonous varieties. Hazelnuts needed collecting and storing. Nothing came easily, and nothing came without significant time investment. What strikes you when examining all these tasks is how they interconnected. You couldn't just focus on one job and ignore the others. Everything had to happen in parallel, which required mental organization that would challenge anyone. The woman had to remember where she was in multiple ongoing processes while responding to immediate needs. The fire needed attention now. The bread was rising and would need checking soon. The cow needed milking in an hour. The wool was almost done carding. A child needed help. The stew was cooking and shouldn't burn. This juggling act happened every single day, with tasks shifting based on season, but never truly stopping. Winter brought different challenges than summer, but neither season offered rest. In winter, the shortened daylight meant working faster during available light hours. In summer, the extended daylight meant more time for outdoor work that couldn't be done in darkness. There was always something demanding attention, always another task waiting. And here's what makes this even more remarkable. Viking women didn't just maintain households. Many of them ran entire farms when men went on trading expeditions or raids that could last months or even years. During those absences, women made all the decisions about planting, harvesting, animal management, and resource allocation. They negotiated with neighbors, settled disputes, and kept everything functioning. The household didn't pause because the man was gone. It continued under her management, and it had to succeed. We're going to look at something that consumed more time than almost anything else, something so central to Viking life that it defined much of how these women structured their days: textile production. That's what consumed those hours. Making cloth was not a quick task you squeezed into spare moments. It was an enormous, multi-stage undertaking that required expertise at every phase. Let's walk through what this actually involved, because most people today have no concept of how clothing reached someone's body in this era. It started with sheep. The woman had to know when sheep were ready for shearing, which typically happened once per year in late spring or early summer. She needed to recognize the signs that the wool was separating from the new growth underneath, making shearing easier. The actual shearing required skill to avoid cutting the animal or damaging the fleece. She used hand shears, essentially large scissors, working carefully around the sheep's body. But getting the wool off the animal was just the beginning. Raw fleece was dirty, greasy, and full of debris. It contained lanolin, the natural oils that protected sheep from weather. Before that wool could become anything useful, it required extensive cleaning. The woman soaked the fleece in water, often heated, and worked it carefully to remove dirt without causing the fibers to mat together into felt. This washing happened in stages, with multiple rinses, and it took days because wool had to dry between washings. Once clean and dry, the real work began. Every bit of that fleece needed processing by hand. The woman used wool combs or carders, tools with fine metal teeth that aligned the fibers and removed any remaining debris. She took small sections of wool and pulled them through the combs repeatedly until the fibers lay parallel and smooth. This process, called carding, prepared the wool for spinning. Now here's where the time investment becomes staggering. To create thread from those carded fibers, she spun them. Most people today, if they picture spinning at all, imagine a spinning wheel. Vikings didn't have those yet. The spinning wheel wouldn't reach Scandinavia for several more centuries. Instead, Viking women used a drop spindle. A drop spindle is deceptively simple. It's a shaft with a weight, called a whirl, attached near one end. The spinner attaches fibers to the shaft, sets the spindle spinning, and as it rotates, the fibers twist into thread. Gravity pulls the spindle downward as thread forms. When the spindle reaches the ground, she winds the new thread onto the shaft and begins again. This process is slow, incredibly slow by modern standards. An experienced spinner might produce perhaps 100 yards of thread in a day of continuous work. But she needed thousands of yards to make fabric for clothing. A single dress could require miles of thread, literally miles. And she couldn't just sit and spin all day without interruption. Remember all those other tasks? They didn't stop. So spinning happened in fragments. A bit while sitting near the fire in evening. Some while watching children play. A section while chatting with neighbours. The woman carried her spindle with her, working whenever hands were free. You can spot this in archaeological evidence. Spindle whirls appear everywhere in Viking settlements, in every building, because women spun constantly. The thread itself required decisions. How thick should it be? That depended on intended use. Fine thread for undergarments took longer to spin but created softer fabric. Thicker thread worked faster but produced coarser cloth suitable for outer garments. She adjusted her technique based on what the household needed, which meant tracking in her head what clothing was wearing out and what would need replacing. After spinning came weaving. Finally, those miles of thread could become fabric. But weaving presented its own complexity. The Viking woman used a warp-weighted loom, a large upright frame that leaned against a wall. Setting up this loom was itself a major undertaking. She attached one set of threads, the warp, to a top beam, then weighted these threads with clay or stone weights at the bottom to maintain tension. These weights, like spindle whorls, appear constantly in archaeological digs. The second set of threads, the weft, she wove horizontally through the vertical warp threads. She passed a shuttle carrying weft thread over and under the warp threads, then beat the new row tight against the previous one with a weaving sword. Then she changed which warp threads were up or down and passed the shuttle back through, over and under, beat it tight, change the shed, pass the shuttle, over and over and over. A skilled weaver might produce a few inches of fabric per day. A simple dress required several yards of cloth. You can do the math. Weeks of weaving for a single garment, and that's after the weeks or months of spinning that came before it. But wait, there's more. The fabric coming off the loom was still not finished. It needed fulling, a process of washing and beating the cloth to tighten the weave and make it warmer and more water resistant. For wool, this involved soaking the fabric and working it aggressively, sometimes by stomping on it, which caused the fibers to mat slightly and create a denser material. Then came dyeing, if the woman wanted coloured fabric. Natural dyes came from plants, lichens, minerals, and insects. Different colours required different materials and techniques. Red came from madder root, yellow from various plants like weld. Blue, the most prized colour, came from woad, which required complex processing. Getting consistent colours demanded experience and careful attention to temperature, timing, and proportions. She had to gather these dye materials herself or trade for them. She needed to prepare them correctly. She had to understand which fabrics would take which dyes and how to set the colour so it wouldn't wash out immediately. This was chemistry without a textbook, learned through practice and passed down through generations. Only after all of this could she finally cut and sew the fabric into clothing. And clothing wore out. It needed repairs, patches, replacements. The cycle never ended because fabric production never ended. A household might have several people needing clothing, and all of it came from this process. Let's consider the scale. Estimates suggest a Viking household might need to produce 40 to 50 yards of fabric per year just to maintain everyone in basic clothing and household textiles like blankets. At a few inches per day of weaving after months of spinning, you see why textile production dominated so much time. And none of this accounts for more specialized textiles. Sails for ships required enormous amounts of fabric, woven specially to withstand wind and weather. A single sail could demand hundreds of hours of work. Some sources suggest communities pooled resources for sailmaking, with multiple women contributing, but that still represented massive collective effort. Archaeological finds show us the quality these women achieved. Some surviving textile fragments display complex patterns, even plaid designs created by using different colored threads in specific sequences. This wasn't crude cloth. It was sophisticated textile work requiring planning, skill, and precision. The woman had to envision the pattern, calculate which threads went where, and execute it correctly across yards of fabric. One mistake early in the setup could ruin the entire piece. What's remarkable is that this massive time investment was simply expected. It was normal. Every woman knew textile production from childhood, learning first simple tasks like carding wool, then progressing to spinning, then eventually weaving. By adulthood, these skills were so ingrained that hands could work while attention focused elsewhere. The muscle memory allowed conversation during spinning or planning meals while weaving. But muscle memory didn't eliminate the time requirement. Those hours still had to come from somewhere, which meant they came from the same finite days that held all those other tasks we discussed earlier. Now layer on top of this something we haven't fully explored yet. These women weren't just workers, they were mothers. Children required care, attention, teaching, and supervision. An infant needed feeding every few hours. A toddler needed watching constantly to prevent accidents in a dangerous environment. Older children needed education in all these skills we've been discussing. A woman might have 6 or 7 children over her lifetime, several of them needing simultaneous care at different ages. How did she manage textile production with a baby on her hip? The answer involves strategies we'd recognize today as multitasking, though that seems inadequate to describe the reality. Spinning worked well with childcare because it was portable and interruptible. She could spin while watching children play, stopping when intervention was needed, resuming when crisis passed. The drop spindle dangled while she settled an argument or wiped a nose. Weaving presented more challenges because the loom wasn't portable and required sustained attention. Some cultures developed techniques where young children could help with simple weaving tasks, turning childcare time into education time. A 5-year-old could pass a shuttle through a shed, learning the rhythm under supervision. This served double duty, advancing the work while teaching essential skills. But infants couldn't help, and toddlers created more problems than they solved near a loom with its weights and threads. Women with very young children often did more spinning than weaving, returning to the loom during brief windows when babies napped or older children could supervise younger ones. Extended family structures helped here. A grandmother past her childbearing years could focus more on weaving, while her daughter with young children did more spinning. Sisters could coordinate, one watching all the children while others worked at looms. These arrangements required proximity and cooperation. Another reason Viking Age people lived in clusters rather than isolated farmsteads whenever possible. Consider what happened when a woman fell ill. Everyone got sick sometimes, and in an era without modern medicine, illnesses could be severe and lengthy. If she couldn't work for a week, that textile production simply didn't happen. The household didn't accumulate credit to use later. Those days were lost, and the clothing still wore out on schedule. This vulnerability meant communities developed support systems. Neighbors might help with essential tasks, or a recovering woman might face weeks of catching up, working longer hours to compensate for lost time. Pregnancy added another layer. A pregnant woman in her third trimester couldn't move as easily, tired more quickly, and had to manage physical discomfort while maintaining her work. After birth came recovery and the demands of nursing. Yet the work didn't pause. The spinning still needed doing. The loom still waited. Archaeological evidence suggests infant mortality rates around 20 to 30% in Viking Age Scandinavia. Many women experienced the grief of losing a child while still facing the relentless demands of daily work. There was no bereavement leave from textile production. Let's return to our time calculation with this fuller picture. We established that textile production alone could consume 20 to 30 hours per week minimum. Add childcare, which for a woman with young children meant essentially constant availability even when other work happened simultaneously. Add food production, preservation, cooking, which we discussed earlier. Add cleaning, maintenance, all those other tasks. Add the mental load of planning, organizing, and coordinating all of this. The hours don't fit into a week. They just don't, not if we count them honestly. So what gives? Something has to bend because time is finite. The answer is that everything happened at a lower standard than we'd consider acceptable today, or different activities got compressed together in ways that reduced efficiency, or people simply worked more hours than we'd consider reasonable. Probably all three simultaneously. The cleaning wasn't thorough by modern standards. Meals were simpler and more repetitive than we'd prefer. Textile work happened in stolen moments throughout the day, rather than focused blocks of time. And the total working hours extended far beyond a modern 40-hour week, bleeding into what we'd consider personal time or rest time. Sleep was probably shorter and more interrupted than recommended today. Women rose before dawn and worked into the evening by firelight. They didn't have weekends in the modern sense. Seasonal variations existed, with winter allowing somewhat more indoor work time, while summer demanded field labor. But there was no concept of regular days off. Religious festivals provided occasional breaks, but these were rare highlights, not weekly occurrences. We should also acknowledge what this meant for personal development, creativity, or leisure. These concepts, as we understand them, barely existed for most people. A woman might enjoy her work, might take pride in producing beautiful fabric or delicious food, but she didn't have hobbies in the modern sense. She didn't have time for hobbies. Every skill she developed served practical household purposes. If she sang while spinning, the singing made the work more pleasant, but the primary activity remained spinning. If she told stories while weaving, the stories entertained and educated children, but her hands still worked the loom. This raises questions about what we lose when we romanticize the past. There's appeal in the idea of self-sufficiency, of producing everything your household needs with your own hands. Modern people sometimes express nostalgia for simpler times, when life felt more authentic and connected to basic human activities. But the reality involved crushing workloads, no safety nets when things went wrong, constant physical strain, and almost no personal autonomy over how to spend your time. Most women didn't choose this life or find it fulfilling in the way we imagine. They did it because survival demanded it, and because their culture offered no alternatives. Yet we should be careful not to paint these women purely as victims. Within their constraints, they found ways to make life bearable and even enjoyable. The communal aspects of work, women gathering to spin together while talking and singing, provided social connection and support. The pride in producing high-quality textiles offered a sense of accomplishment. The knowledge that their work directly enabled their family's survival gave it meaning, even if that meaning came wrapped in exhaustion. These weren't miserable people, despite the hardship. They were people adapting to their circumstances, finding joy where possible, supporting each other through difficulty, and doing what needed doing. Archaeological evidence gives us glimpses of this. Graves containing high-quality textile tools, like ornate spindle whorls or decorated weaving swords, suggest these items held personal significance. A woman might own a particularly nice spindle the way a modern person owns a favorite pen. It was a tool, yes, but also something handled daily, something that became familiar and even treasured. Some spindle whorls show decorative patterns that served no functional purpose, implying someone cared enough to make them beautiful. That caring matters when understanding these lives. We also find evidence of variation in skill levels. Some textile fragments show expert work, others more basic competence. Not every woman achieved the same level of mastery, which makes sense. People have different aptitudes, different amounts of practice time, different teachers. A woman who particularly excelled at weaving might trade her superior cloth for other goods, creating informal specialization within a community. This wasn't a market economy in the modern sense, but it wasn't pure subsistence either. Flexibility existed within the system. Status differences affected women's experiences too. A wealthy household might own thralls, enslaved people who performed much of the basic labor. A high-status woman still needed to know textile production because she supervised others and because her work on prestigious items demonstrated skill and taste, but her daily reality differed enormously from a poor free woman or an enslaved woman. The enslaved woman carried the heaviest burden, working not just for her own survival, but under compulsion for someone else's benefit, with no control over her circumstances and no prospect of improvement. When we discuss Viking Age women's work, we must remember this spectrum existed. Sources also hint at women's economic power within households. A wife controlled the keys to the household storage, a symbolic and practical authority. She decided when to open stores of food or fabric, managing resources across seasons. This gave her real power over daily life, even if broader social structures limited her options. A competent manager could mean the difference between a household that thrived and one that merely survived. Her decisions about when to plant, what to preserve, how to allocate textile production, all of these shaped her family's well-being. That authority came with responsibility, though. If the household ran short of food in late winter, if clothing wore out too quickly, if important items weren't properly maintained, the blame fell on her shoulders. The pressure was real and constant. Legal codes from later medieval Scandinavia, which likely reflect earlier customs, show women could own property separately from their husbands. They could inherit land and goods. They could initiate divorce under certain circumstances, which was unusual for medieval Europe. These rights suggest women weren't simply extensions of their husbands, but had recognized legal standing. A woman's morning gift, property given to her by her husband the day after marriage, remained hers. If widowed, she controlled it. If divorced, she took it with her. This provided some economic security, though obviously these protections applied mainly to free women of some means. Poor women and enslaved women had few such safeguards. The question of how much agency Viking Age women actually possessed remains contentious among historians. Some emphasize the relative freedoms compared to other medieval societies. Others point out that relative freedom still meant significant restriction compared to men. Both perspectives hold truth. Yes, a Viking Age woman had more legal rights than her contemporary in many other parts of Europe. Yes, she still lived in a fundamentally patriarchal society where men held most formal power, where violence against women was common, where her value was often measured by her productivity and fertility. We should resist the urge to make these women either empowered heroines or helpless victims. They were people navigating systems they didn't create, finding room to maneuver where possible, constrained where not. Some undoubtedly chafed against limitations. Others found fulfillment within available roles. Most probably experienced both feelings at different times, because human beings are complicated and contradictory. The romanticization of Viking women in modern popular culture does them a disservice, actually. When we imagine shield maidens fighting alongside men as equals, we create a fantasy that obscures reality. A few women may have fought. The evidence is ambiguous and debated, but for the vast majority, warfare wasn't their world. Their world was the work described here, the endless cycle of production that kept everyone alive. That work deserves recognition, not because it was glamorous, but because it was essential. Modern people often struggle to grasp how much time basic survival consumed before industrialization. We flip a switch for light, turn a dial for heat, buy clothes already made. Even cooking, which remains a daily task, takes a fraction of the time it once did. A Viking Age woman lived in a world where almost nothing came ready-made. Nearly everything had to be created from raw materials, through labor-intensive processes. The sheer volume of work required to maintain even a modest standard of living staggers the modern imagination. Consider what went into a single garment: raising or trading for wool, processing that wool through multiple stages, spinning it into thread, which might take weeks, weaving it into cloth, more weeks, cutting and sewing the cloth into a garment. All of this before the garment could be worn even once. Then it needed maintenance, washing carefully because soap was caustic and fabric precious, mending tears and worn spots, eventually recycling it into rags or other uses when it wore beyond repair. Multiply this process across every textile item a household needed, and the scale becomes clearer. Then layer in all the other work. Food preservation occupied huge amounts of time. Drying fish and meat, making butter and cheese, pickling vegetables, storing grain properly so it didn't spoil or get eaten by pests. Each process required knowledge, attention, and labor. A mistake could waste precious resources. Spoiled food meant hunger. Improperly stored grain meant disaster. Household maintenance never ended either. Keeping living spaces clean without modern tools meant constant sweeping, scrubbing, hauling water, managing fires. Everything wore out and needed repair. Wooden items cracked and split. Ceramic vessels broke. Metal tools dulled. A competent household manager stayed ahead of these problems, fixing small issues before they became large ones, maintaining equipment so it lasted longer. This work happened year-round with seasonal variations. Winter brought spinning and weaving to the fore since outdoor work decreased. Spring meant planting, summer harvesting and preservation, autumn preparation for winter. The cycle repeated endlessly, each season bringing its specific demands. A woman needed to think ahead constantly, preparing for the next season while managing the current one. We haven't even touched on childcare, which happened simultaneously with all this other work. Viking Age families often had multiple children because infant mortality was high and children were future workers. A woman might be pregnant or nursing for much of her adult life while still performing all her other duties. Small children needed constant supervision to keep them from injury. Older children needed training in the skills they'd need as adults. This education happened through daily work, children learning by helping with age-appropriate tasks. The physical toll of this lifestyle showed in skeletal remains. Archaeologists find evidence of repetitive stress injuries, arthritis, worn joints. Teeth show patterns consistent with using them as tools, perhaps for textile work. Spines show compression from carrying heavy loads. These weren't old people whose bodies had naturally deteriorated. These markers appear in remains of women who died in their 30s and 40s. Their bodies wore out from decades of hard labor. Yet we also find evidence of care. Graves with textile tools placed carefully, showing someone thought these items should accompany the woman in death. Burials with goods suggesting affection and respect. Communities that cared for disabled or injured members who could no longer work productively. Vikings weren't uniquely cruel or uniquely kind. They were people who could be both, often simultaneously. Understanding this labor matters for several reasons. First, it corrects our mental image of the Viking Age. When we picture Vikings, we see longships and raids and warriors. That's maybe 5% of the population occasionally. The other 95%, all the time, were doing work like this. The dramatic stuff happened against a background of ordinary people performing extraordinary amounts of labor to survive. Second, it highlights how recent our modern lifestyle is. The Industrial Revolution began around 200 years ago. For the previous thousands of years of human civilization, life looked more like what's been described here than like our current reality. Our ancestors, all of them, lived this way. The woman spinning thread in 9th century Norway had far more in common with a woman in ancient Rome or medieval China than with us. Understanding that continuity helps us grasp how unusual our current moment is. Third, it emphasizes the value of work that often goes unrecognized. Textile production, food preparation, household management, these tasks still exist. They've been made easier by technology, but someone still does them. Often that someone is a woman, and often that work is undervalued, precisely because it's associated with women and domestic life. Looking back at the Viking Age reminds us this work has always been essential, always been skilled, always required knowledge and effort. The fact that it happened in homes rather than battlefields doesn't make it less important. The Viking Age woman working her spindle wasn't thinking about any of this, obviously. She was thinking about finishing enough thread to start a new piece of cloth, about whether the stew needed more salt, about her daughter's cough, about 100 immediate practical concerns. She didn't have time for philosophical reflection about the nature of her work. She had too much to do. But we can reflect on it. We can recognize the immense labor that sustained Viking Age society. We can acknowledge the skill and knowledge required. We can appreciate the resilience of people who faced challenges we can barely imagine and found ways not just to survive, but to create a culture we still find fascinating over 1,000 years later. That culture rested on the work of women's hands. Every thread, every meal, every maintained household. The ships and swords get the attention, but the cloth and bread made everything else possible. The Viking Age ended not because the work became impossible, but because the world changed around it. Trade networks expanded, towns grew, technologies evolved. That woman at her loom eventually had daughters whose daughters could buy cloth instead of making every thread. The relief must have been profound, but something was lost too. Not in a romanticized way, but in the simple fact that knowledge accumulated over generations became unnecessary and faded. The ability to judge wool quality by touch, to know exactly when bread dough had risen enough, to maintain a fire through a winter night, these skills represented genuine expertise. They vanished, not because they were worthless, but because they became obsolete. We can't recreate that world, and we shouldn't want to. The cost in human suffering, in bodies worn out by labor, in potential unrealized because survival consumed everything, that cost was too high. But we can recognize what it took. We can acknowledge that our comfortable modern lives rest on foundations built by people who worked harder than we can truly comprehend. Every time you pull on a shirt without thinking about it, someone's ancestor spent weeks making that possible. That recognition matters because it connects us to the unbroken chain of human effort stretching back through time. Those women weren't so different from us. They wanted their children safe, their families fed, their work to matter. They just had to achieve it through means that would exhaust us within days. They managed anyway, one tedious task at a time, because that's what survival demanded. The work was brutal, endless, and absolutely essential. Now you know exactly how brutal it was.